And Jefferson's view, furthermore, was that if a law is passed that is unconstitutional, then it is no law at all. It is void. And if it is no law at all, why should we enforce it? Now, we have a ready answer to this. Well, you go for relief to the Supreme Court, and they will grant you relief. Oh, how's that one been working? Has that been limiting government? What's the Supreme Court been up to lately? Well, all it does is police the states. When the states are doing perfectly constitutional things, it polices them. The federal government it's basically done next to nothing to restrain. But consider also, the federal judiciary is part of the federal government. So to say that they would be the impartial umpire between themselves and the states is, I think, kind of a farce. If you and I are having a dispute and I say, I know who will decide this, my cousin, you would immediately know you were being had. So the Supreme Court answer is no good. Jefferson's view is there is no common umpire to judge constitutional disputes between the federal government and the states. And so, as in any other case of parties where there is no common judge, it devolves in the last resort upon the parties themselves, namely the states whose ratifications in effect gave effect to the federal government. It is those bodies who in the last resort are to be the judges. Now, Jefferson memorably spelled out these principles in the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 that he drafted and that were passed by the Kentucky legislature. They were in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts of that year. Some of you already know about these. I'll just mention briefly about the Sedition Act. That it actually made it a crime in which you would be subject to potential fines and jail time to be excessively critical in a manner that would bring into disrepute the president, the Congress, or the federal government as a whole. And this law was, in fact, rather liberally applied. If you look at the offenses for which some people were punished, they're pretty minor. I mean, today, we would think they were unbelievably lame for the thing. They weren't being bold enough, and yet we had we had at least one congressman imprisoned over it. We had journalists as well. It was obviously a partisan measure whose intention was to go after the Jeffersonians, the Republicans, and to build up the Federalists by contrast. And Jefferson thought, well, I'm not willing to say, hey, it was fun having constitutional government for 10 years, but all good things must come to an end, and that's the end of it. His view was the same view the colonists took with regard to the British Empire, was that, sure, they may be doing something trivial now, although, of course, the Sedition Act is far from trivial. But the point is that if we don't resist it, they're going to be encouraged to try more things. They're just going to do more and more and more, so we have to stop it cold. So Jefferson drafts these resolutions. Meanwhile, James Madison drafts the Virginia resolutions of 1798. The word nullification appears first in Jefferson's draft of the Kentucky resolutions, not in the final copy. But then a year later, in follow-up resolutions of 1799, the word nullification, a nullification of the unconstitutional law is the rightful remedy, said Kentucky. James Madison preferred the term interposition, state interposition, which evokes the image of the state standing between the federal government and its in effect void law, and the people of the state on the other. The state is the protector of its people against the federal government. That was the image that's evoked by interposition. Now, it's true, when these resolutions were passed by these state legislatures, the other states did not send statements of approval. To the contrary, the states that did respond were dismissive of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and the principle of nullification. And so we are taught that therefore these are invalid principles and there's nothing to see here. Well, let's look a little more deeply. First of all, if you look at the states that responded to Virginia and Kentucky, and I've looked through them all, I find only one of them, namely Delaware. Peculiarly enough, we're in the Delaware room. Only one of those states didn't add to its protest against Virginia and Kentucky its complete support for the Alien and Sedition Acts. So yeah, it's true, New England states were very much against nullification because they were in favor of violating the First Amendment. And they were in favor of the Sedition Act. So that's supposed to make me rethink these ideas because a bunch of bozos who don't know the Constitution didn't like it? That's the argument that's being raised. Sanford Levinson is one of these mainstream drone historians who you can predict everything that's going to come out of his mouth. He's never had an unconventional thought in his life. Wrote an article for a Texas newspaper recently because of the mention of nullification that we've heard in the Texas gubernatorial race. And of course, the establishment's role at a time like this, when the people start to get uppity and they start to get new ideas about how they might reclaim their rights, it's the role of the establishment to step in and say, nothing to see here, people. You can't do this. But you know what, I really don't care what Sanford Levinson says I can or can't do. You know, I mean, I might be inclined to do it anyway. And he says in this article, oh, no, the other states didn't like these resolutions, without acknowledging that almost all of them came out and explicitly said the Alien and Sedition Acts are perfectly constitutional. Well, I mean, whose side do you want to be on in that dispute? But more than that, I mean, this is law. I mean, this is really, you have to be a serious crumb to pull this trick. He quotes Rhode Island's response to Virginia and Kentucky from 1799. And Rhode Island says, oh, you can't do this. Why? We have a Supreme Court to decide all these issues. And of course, Rhode Island knows the Supreme Court is full of Federalist judges who are going to uphold the law. And so he quotes this and says, so you see, look, Rhode Island, I don't know where Rhode Island suddenly became infallible, but Rhode Island had this statement, and it just goes to show the whole idea is stupid. But here's what Sanford Levinson doesn't acknowledge. Just 10 years later, the legislature of Rhode Island is giving voice to the principles of nullification in 1798. And he doesn't mention that in his article. He tells us that, hey, the legislature of Rhode Island wrote this mean letter in 1799, and that ends it. Well, I don't think it does end it, because I think actions speak louder than, you know, a couple of letters. And given that 10 years later, Rhode Island's legislature was in fact appealing to these very principles, I think that is pretty relevant. That's an oversight, some kind of accidental oversight in Sanford Levinson's article, and I want to rectify that oversight right now. Let's quote from the Rhode Island legislature, which apparently Sanford Levinson holds in the greatest esteem. Let's see what they had to say in 1809. That to preserve the Union and to support the Constitution of the United States, it becomes the duty of this General Assembly to be vigilant in guarding from usurpation and violation those powers and rights which the good people of this state have expressly reserved to themselves and have ever refused to delegate. And they went on to say that the state has the right, and this is the words, this is Rhode Island speaking, to interpose, the word from Virginia resolutions, to interpose for the purpose of protecting the people of Rhode Island from the ruinous inflictions of usurped and unconstitutional power. So I think that helps to complete the historical record. Like, if we want to be honest, instead of shills for the regime, this is how we should be doing history. Now, Jefferson didn't just wake up one day and think up nullification. You know, like, he didn't just get drunk and then the next morning, you know, hung over, looking at it, saying, "Oh man, I hope I haven't submitted these yet." This is actually the working out of ideas that go back at least to the ratifying convention of Virginia and even to the colonial period. But let's just look to 1788. Virginia is poised to ratify the Constitution or not. Nobody knows. It was supporters of the Constitution. No, that is not a verbal misprint. It was supporters of the Constitution, the Federalists, who at that ratifying convention made clear that people like Patrick Henry, who were afraid that this would become an unlimited government, they wanted to assure people like that that would not happen. The federal government would have only those powers expressly delegated to it. And in fact, Edmund Randolph, who became the first Attorney General of the United States, used the words expressly delegated. It will have only those powers. And he said, and look, the style of ratification, that is to say, the manner in which we ratify this Constitution, will make clear how we interpret it, how we interpret the nature of this union we're entering into. And that style was that in the process of ratifying the Constitution, they were going to issue an instrument of ratification, a document explaining how they understand the nature of this union. And in that document, it was going to be made clear, according to George Nicholas. Let me pause for a minute. George Nicholas became the first Attorney General of Kentucky, and Nicholas and Randolph both sat on the 5-person commission whose job it was to draft the instrument of ratification, so he would have been in a position to know. George Nicholas said, look, if this federal government should go beyond the powers we have delegated to it, then Virginia will be exonerated from it. So that's an even more extreme remedy than nullification. He's clearly contemplating full-fledged withdrawal from the Union. We shall be held innocent if we resist. I mean, this is made clear in the ratifying convention. We shall be exonerated. So this was the understanding on which the Constitution was sold to the people of Virginia. And if you look at the 1790s, they're consistently quoting from these statements from the ratifying convention. Patrick Henry passes a resolution through the Virginia legislature in 1790 saying that Alexander Hamilton is already up to no good. And remember what they told us in the ratifying convention. The federal government will have only those powers expressly delegated.